My name is Justin the Clue, and I'm here today with
Will Sloan.
And you're listening to the Important Cinema Club. And today, we revisit a favorite of ours, Mr. Clint Eastwood. But we've talked about him as a director in the past, and this time, we're talking about him as an actor, specifically in films that he did not direct or were directed by his cronies. And let's be honest, that's a real thin selection.
Justin. Hey, Justin. Do you feel lucky? Do you feel lucky, punk?
Oh, I have to say, Don Siegel, not a crony of Clint Eastwood, but Don Siegel is such a powerful director. I feel like a whole episode could be dedicated to him.
That's right. We didn't want to waste this opportunity to discuss Siegel or Sergio Leone, which, yes, left slimmer pickings. More than anything, we wanted to discuss Clint Eastwood as a star persona. And I am actually, though, interested in talking about these directors a little bit because authorship is an interesting thing in the cinema of Clint Eastwood. There are certain people like, Don Siegel, whose sensibility meshed very closely with Clint Eastwood's, not just in obvious films like Dirty Harry, but also in the experiments they did together like The Beguiled.
And then you have to take into account the reason that the offerings are so slim is that Clint Eastwood early on in his career, specifically after Where Eagles Dare, decided this is a waste of resources and money. I don't like how Hollywood pictures are made. So I'm going to create my own production company, Malpaso Productions, and I will basically be in charge of every film that I make from this point forward.
And so there are many movies that Clint Eastwood technically did not direct. He's not the credited director on, but if it begins with a Malpaso production, it's a Clint Eastwood authored film, generally.
And if you're looking at the list here of the film that we're going to talk about, you'll be like, wait a minute, all of these are Malpaso productions. Okay, you got us. But we wanted to kind of discuss films that it doesn't specifically feel like Clint was involved from end to end. And so, like, you start with something like Paint Your Wagon, and boy, does this test the Clint Eastwood as an actor question we're asking today.
Right. So all three of the movies we watched for this episode, I think, pose interesting questions when it comes to Clint Eastwood's star persona and the way that it relates to authorship. Because we're going to talk about one movie later on that truly is directed by one of his cronies. Many times in the Malpaso movies, somebody starts as an assistant director or somewhere, further down the chain of command. And Clint, feeling a little tired, maybe he's making a one for them movie so he can get a more personal project financed later, a Dirty Harry sequel or a movie where he hangs out with an orangutan. He throws an opportunity to, the stunt coordinator, to be the credited director. But we're also going to talk about a movie later on that's directed by somebody who I think most would regard as an auteur, working within the Malpaso system. But then before all that, we're talking about that post-Dollars trilogy, pre-Dirty Harry, pre-Malpaso, pre-Play Misty for Me period, when he's in movies like Where Eagles Dare or, yes, Paint Your Wagon.
Technically, Paint Your Wagon does have Malpaso Productions credited to it, but they were not the main kind of guiding force of the film. But before we even get to the movies, is there an actor with a more defined persona than Clint Eastwood? Like, if I tell my parents, maybe even a random person on the street, hey, how would you describe Clint Eastwood? Most people would describe him in the same way. He is intense, he's squinting, and he's also kind of, maybe he'll talk like this when he says his lines.
It's amazing. He has one of the most powerful screen presences of all time, one of the most intense screen presences. He's somebody who can communicate so much while doing so little. And yet, as we see in some of these films, it's one of the most fragile screen presences of all time, too. If it goes just too far outside of its range, it can all come crashing down like a house of cards. And there are many films that Eastwood has directed where he does interesting things with his persona. Films like, well, he didn't direct this one, but Tightrope. Films like Unforgiven. Frankly, a movie like The Mule. These movies like prod at the persona and do interesting things with it. But then there's something like Paint Your Wagon, where he's supposed to be one of the leads of a 2.5-hour musical comedy in the tradition of The Sound of Music and other like Hindenburg scaled musical comedies of the 1960s. And, this movie has mostly gone down in history for two reasons: for being a gigantic flop and for being parodied on The Simpsons.
And Paint Your Wagon if you're looking at on paper, the decisions to cast Lee Marvin and Clint Eastwood in these roles are not out of the question. This is a famous Broadway musical play that is also a Western, who are two guys that you associate with Westerns, Lee Marvin and Clint Eastwood. Now, I do want to take a step back. I was doing a little bit of research in Paint Your Wagon, and I know this will sound dismissive, but this is one of those plays that you look at it and you go, there must have been only like 2 plays that existed at this point in time when it came out, which is why anyone would like this in any form. I also want to say, I feel like people are going to come on here hoping for a defense of Paint Your Wagon. I don't know where Will stands with this particular film, but this may have been one of the longest movie experiences that I've had in a very long time. At one point, the intermission card comes up and I went, oh my God. Can you imagine being in the theater, probably being like a teenager dragged to this movie by your parents, seeing that intermission card pop up and realizing you still have another half of this movie to go?
Well, I'm very pleased to be able to offer at least a partial defense or a qualified defense or like a 30% defense of this movie.
I could give that same defense. Like, it's big, I like Lee Marvin, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, it's beautiful. You can't deny that this movie is beautiful. The cinematography.
But I could be watching like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Heaven's Gate, like any of the other movies that I actually enjoy watching, even if they're more, due to the content, miserable experience. This is supposed to be a light and fluffy story about a man that buys a woman from another Mormon man and the romance that blossoms from that, spread over an agonizing length of time.
Right. McCabe and Mrs. Miller is an apt comparison because this is also a movie about, a makeshift ad hoc settler town during the gold rush. Another movie, like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, it has a bit of that dirt and grime and fog atmosphere, although it looks much more like a Hudson River School painting. It's very beautiful. It's relentlessly beautiful. In fact, every shot a painting. Cinematography by William A. Fraker, by the way, and I always love checking the credits of a cinematographer because he shot Rosemary's Baby, Tombstone, Bullet, War Games, Heaven Can Wait, and he also shot Street Fighter with Jean-Claude Van Damme, A Vegas Vacation, Memoirs of an Invisible Man, and the Val Kilmer, Marlon Brando, Island of Dr. Moreau. Typical of a cinematographer's career to have credits like this.
And you also have the person that adapted the stage play, Paddy Chayefsky,
unbelievable,
doing his best with the material. Yeah. I mean, this is a film like just set up to fail because there's so much kind of talent and money put into it in something that I looked. There have been revivals of Paint Your Wagon recently. Like, does it play on stage? Because it ain't playing in this movie is what I'm going to say, under the leaden lens of Broadway director Joshua Logan.
And Joshua Logan has one of those fantastic cursed filmographies where he directed Bus Stop. So he was lucky enough to, just happen to be manning the camera when Marilyn Monroe became a star. But he also directed such other 60s behemoths as South Pacific and Camelot. But further to the tortured defense of this movie, or the partial defense, because, what can I say? We all know this movie isn't a lot of fun.
No. Well, you know what? I will say the beginning of the movie did have me leaning in a little bit. It starts very wacky with a out of control wagon that crashes. The camera's attached to that wagon as you follow it. There's a Mad Magazine style joke where Lee Marvin and his cronies find gold while they're burying a guy, and the guy's body pops out of the grave like a cartoon. And I was like, all right, more of this kind of Popeye by way of Robert Altman comedy, please. And the movie goes, we got you in. We ain't giving you nothing like this again.
Oh, but didn't you like it when the town sank into quicksand towards the end? I thought there was some pretty fun gags during that scene.
I mean, when the highlight of the movie is just Lee Marvin going to take a piss and taking a face first fall into a river, I'm like, hey, it's actually Lee Marvin that did that in this giant behemoth multi-million-dollar production. You got some problems with the kind of material you're dealing with. I mean, what's your favorite song, Will?
The Wandering Star. The song. I like the song. The song that Lee Marvin sings, I kind of like.
Yeah, anytime Lee Marvin opens his mouth, I'm leaning in forward because I'm like, this poor drunk bastard has to sing these songs. I'm going to give you one take.
So the gender politics of the plot are obviously a little wonky because it's an all-male town, and basically Lee Marvin brings in Jean Seberg. He buys her as his wife, and the movie has one scene that I think the movie thinks is feminist, where like he on their wedding night he brings her in and he undresses her and he's just gonna mount her with barely a hello, and then she gets to have one speech where she says, now listen here, you may have bought me fair and square, but you were to treat me as a wife. And I think that this is the movie trying to gesture towards, you know what, women are human beings too.
And Lee Marvin goes, yes, no problem, I will spend the rest of the movie being fire and angry and guilty of any man that looks your way. That will be my comedic game for the next 7 hours of Paint Your Wagon.
But of course, he and Clint Eastwood form a quasi-polycule with Gene Seberg, which I also kind of enjoyed. But I respect the decision, even if I don't think it worked, to hire two non-singers to lead the movie.
I agree.
Clint Eastwood is trying to sing, but, his voice is pretty thin and wavery, as we all know. Lee Marvin truly cannot sing. And so...
Well, he's just doing a Rex Harrison, right? Where he's like, wandering star.
And I think there can be something charming about non-singers leading movies like this. But what I would say is I think the main problem is that Lee Marvin and Clint Eastwood are a little bit too much the same sort of guy to be leading this movie. I think together, like as a musical comedy duo, I think it would have been better if one of them was a little bit lighter and, they could have generated a little bit of productive friction. It's like watching Abbott and Abbott as a comedy team.
Well, I mean, Lee Marvin is very big in this movie, as Lee Marvin at his best tends to do. While Clint Eastwood is given very little material to chew on, right? Which makes you think of, like, what is the persona of Clint Eastwood? Like, you think of him, probably the first thing that you think of is Dirty Harry, or A Fistful of Dollars, him coming in to town, just squinting under the sun. Those are the iconic defining things of Clint Eastwood that I think that your mind will snap to over and over again. While this is more of, and we should say that me and you do not have any kind of baggage of him being on stuff like Rawhide. He was a very present TV guy. And that's something that like we don't bring with us when we watch Paint Your Wagon, but people may already have that association to put him in this different context.
I confess I've never seen Rawhide, but I understand that...
Rawhide!
Yeah, I mean, I've seen John Belushi sing the song, but I understand that Clint Eastwood was a rather more... Well, he was a bigger presence on Rawhide than he would be in movies later. I mean... His entrance in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, I remember watching that movie with a friend who had never seen it. And just like when he enters, the right of the frame, I remember my friend going, whoa,
Yeah.
There's just something. And it's not just because it's Clint Eastwood. It's because there's something undefinable about like, sorry, as I said, it's undefinable. It's the Star is Born moment where this guy is doing the proportion to like what he's giving and what he's emanating is like so vast.
Does there need to be a kind of grit in a Clint Eastwood performance for us to kind of connect with him? Because that is the defining trait for the majority of his career, whether he be playing comedic characters or serious characters. There's a heavy intensity. And I mean, you can associate that just with his gaze, but also his presence, his voice, and his look. And there's just none of that in Paint Your Wagon because it is the antithesis of everything that we think of as Clint Eastwood today.
Well, I think about like the Dollars trilogy and particularly The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The title obviously is ironic, the idea that he's the good. It's this somewhat jaundiced next generation take on the Western. And throughout, Clint Eastwood as like the good guy, the guy in the white hat, there's always something on his mind. He's always like, smirking a little quietly, or he's always like, got a secret joke that he's telling himself. He conveys a lot through understatement in that movie. And then you have this movie, Paint Your Wagon, where, I think a musical comedy like Paint Your Wagon is antithetical to the sort of thing that Clint Eastwood was doing in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Like, there's not room for that sort of wry understatement.
Do you think that Clint Eastwood, in his persona, and the reason that people attach themselves to him, is not just an intensity, but like you mentioned, an almost, I'm a little bit better than what's going on. It's almost like the quintessential dad feeling of being in any kind of situation, and he can represent that on screen.
Well, okay, yeah, it's like when Dirty Harry says, "Go ahead, make my day." Like, that's powerful understatement. Or when he says, you have to ask yourself, do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? You know, he's so in control that he can laugh about the situation and do a wry little joke just for himself. It can be powerful and fascinating when that persona is put through Unforgiven, which shows a much more vulnerable side of that persona, or Cry Macho, or The Mule, some of these later ones. But then in Paint Your Wagon, when it's him singing, I talk to the trees,
yeah.
You know?
It feels like he's out of control.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
not what we associate with Clint Eastwood.
He's out of control in a very different way than he is in Unforgiven.
Unforgiven, it almost feels like he's in control but tired and doesn't want to see this stuff happen that he knows is going to happen, which makes sense when you kind of follow the arc of his career. Now, Clint Eastwood is not a guy that didn't really do comedy. Like, there's comedic roles you can associate Clint Eastwood with, but he is always, well, I mean, you're more of a Clint expert than I am, kind of the straight man in these situations. Like, if you look at the comedies that he was in, like Pink Cadillac, Bronco Billy, City Heat, woof. It's just like the material around him doesn't elevate to his level, and he's also or he's not lowering himself to the level for the comedy to play. Like, you could almost imagine in a different world Clint Eastwood having a Robert De Niro-like comedy run, but he never has.
Yeah, he's maintained much firmer grip on his career and his persona than Robert De Niro has. Probably it's at least partly a result of like also being his own producer and director and being consistently, you know, financially successful as a producer and director that he's been able to do that. Some Robert De Niro's interests have expanded to being a real estate mogul and other things. So he's taken a lot of jobs like The War with Grandpa just to pay for that empire. And Eastwood has managed himself much more tightly.
Now, you were showing me some passages from the biography of Clint Eastwood by Patrick McGilligan. And McGilligan, that guy who loves his drama, as we talked about last episode, he points out that like Clint real life persona, day-to-day interacting with people, is much more jovial than you would expect. He's got almost a juvenile sense of humor, and that's something that he's very consciously never really articulated in any of the films that he starred in, except probably the closest he's ever gotten to is the let's call it the orangutan duology, where it's Every Which Way But Loose and Any Which Way You Can. Movies that I'm shocked that me and Will have never seen.
Well, and you know, these movies, I haven't looked at the numbers, but they may still be, adjusted for inflation, his biggest hit. Every Which Way But Loose was a top 5 movie in 1978, a massive blockbuster. And I feel like, I mean, I don't want to say they're not watched anymore, but I mean, they were ephemeral, like pop movies for mass audiences at that time. And I don't think people have treasured them over the years in the same way that they do Unforgiven. Like, they were kind of disposable entertainment.
Well, I think they kind of live in that mirror image actor to Clint Eastwood, Burt Reynolds' career, right? Like Smokey and the Bandit, people know what it is. And, you know, people who love it probably watch it, but you don't see people sharing gifs of Smokey and the Bandit online that much, or going like, you gotta see Smokey and the Bandit, even though that our collective unconscious, we know these movies. Like, we've probably seen in our life more parodies of Every Which Way But Loose. I think of The Critic, where there's a clip of like Clint Eastwood being like, and now I'm just going to turn off the light and kiss the woman in the bed, even though that I can't see anything, and I will keep kissing her, even if she perhaps feels like an orangutan. So it feels like we get it, which is funny when you watch the movie and you're like, oh, this first one is not what I thought it was going to be.
Well, we mentioned that Clint Eastwood has been a very canny and savvy manager of his career over the years. Throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, he's constantly alternating, you know, flagrantly commercial enterprises with more personal films like White Hunter, Black Heart, or Bird. And this is one of the most flagrantly commercial of all. It is a bald-faced attempt to emulate what was so successful for Burt Reynolds around that time. I was reminded, though, of how different Eastwood's persona is from Burt Reynolds. Similar, but crucially different.
Well, Burt Reynolds, I mean, he's done serious roles, but I think people associate him more as a comedic figure than Clint Eastwood.
Burt Reynolds is always smiling. He's always smirking. He's always having a good time. He's always patting people on the back. Not the case with Eastwood.
I mean, just look at the cover of Every Which Way But Loose, and it's kind of like Smokey and the Bandit, Cannonball Run, like big painted collection of wacky characters that are in the movie. But Clint Eastwood in it is just like stone-faced, arms out, cool guy, but there's an orangutan that's giving him a hug. Isn't the wildest thing about this movie that the orangutan is almost kind of like the third most important part of this film? That like, even in the way that it's introduced, is like, yeah, he owns an orangutan. Why not? We're not even going to contextualize this until a half an hour into the movie.
Right. So this movie, which runs a drum tight 110 minutes, not a bit of fat on the bones of this thing.
That's because, this was a movie, even though it came out in 1978, that was made for people to tune in on TV and go, oh yeah, I know this movie. Doesn't matter where you tune in. It might as well just be 30 minutes in. The movie ends in a way where I was like, what, it's over? I guess it's over. The credits are rolling.
Well, I understand that this movie was released in December of 1978 and was an early example of saturation booking. It opened at like 1,500 screens all over the United States at a time when that was not particularly common. And it was particularly densely packed into, middle America and the South and the suburbs, territories that have typically been home to Clint's most fervent fan base. And you can see that this is the kind of movie that, like, during the holidays, you get the truck and you put, all 25 members of the family in it, and you take them to the local theater to see Every Which Way But Loose. Something for everybody in here.
Yeah, you're like, what do people like Clint Eastwood? Are there any, like, and I'm sure there are, like, Clint Eastwood haters? Was there a Jim Carrey-like dislike of him from parental figures? That's like, I don't like that Clint Eastwood guy. Now I can understand, like, a liberal dislike of what he represents once Dirty Harry comes out, but even detached from that, a kind of like, I don't like his persona on screen. I'm sure it exists, but I don't think I've ever heard it vocalized in person.
I think there were probably a lot of people who regarded him as a limited actor, which, he is to some degree. But yeah, when I think of the Clint backlash, I think of it mostly being from like critics like Pauline Kael, who regarded him as a fascist.
That it's more of the kind of political leanings of his movies as opposed to his persona, because his persona, as we keep saying, so defined, so comforting in a way that, like, Every Which Way But Loose, yeah, let's go see a Clint movie, one that the whole family can enjoy. And it should be noted, this movie is basically plotless. Like 45 minutes pass before they're like, I guess we should go do this thing. Clint Eastwood plays a guy whose job seemingly is just going around and fighting people for money. He is the best fighter. Everybody loves him. He loves doing practical jokes with his brother, Jeffrey Lewis. He's also a mama's boy. He lives with Ruth Gordon, and she needs to take her driving test. And yeah, that's pretty much... Oh, and there's an orangutan named Clyde that he lives with as well.
Yeah, this movie feels like the deleted scenes. It feels like almost
100%.
Almost 2 hours of scenes that were cut from the movie, fashioned into a movie. It's like Anchorman 1.5 or one of those things where they just...
Wake Up Ron Burgundy?
To the extent that there's a plot, it's Clint Eastwood going around fighting the world, and he meets Sandra Locke, has a brief romance with her, and then she skips town unceremoniously, very quickly, and he spends the rest of the movie trying to find her.
I never even met Clyde. Don't you want to meet Clyde, my orangutan?
Of course, there are shocking revelations about her later, but there are also a whole cast of supporting characters. There's a villainous Nazi sect who are pursuing him.
But they're such jokes. They're never a threat. They're taken down by everyone they meet, including Ruth Gordon.
There's also my favorite actor, Gregory Walcott, the star of Plan 9 from Outer Space, who shows up as the evil sheriff of some town who, unluckily for him, got beaten up in a bar brawl with Clint and swears revenge on him.
What a kind of like breezy nothing movie where like the sheriff can decide I'm just gonna follow this Clint Eastwood guy across the country because I got nothing better to do. No one in this movie has anything better to do, and I think this is also Clint kind of reacting not only to Smokey and the Bandit but also to New Hollywood, being like, is this what you guys want? Kind of like plotless movies where we just drive a bunch. The Nazis fall in mud. The orangutan gives the finger out of the car window. That's what people love, right?
Well, I don't know about New Hollywood, but I did think about how, for years people have said that, like, Spielberg and George Lucas like killed the new Hollywood, but I really think they killed movies like this. They killed back when this used to be like the number 3 movie of the year, like the biggest movie of the holiday season. Impossibly long, hangout movies that played in rural and southern drive-ins, I feel like got phased out by Return of the Jedi.
Well, this is basically a wallpaper film that you can come in and out. The perfect place to see it will be at the drive-in. You're like, I gotta go to the bathroom. Poof, I won't miss anything, right? We'd even mention the director, James Fargo, who was an assistant director on a bunch of Clint Eastwood pictures, would later go on to direct Force Vengeance, the one where Chuck Norris takes on the Hong Kong mob, as well as Voyage of the Rock Aliens, the very odd 80s musical, which is also a lot of fun. And he is basically, in the context of this film, putting the camera probably where Clint is telling him to put it. And then maybe he gets to say action as well.
And I learned from the very damning Patrick McGilligan bio of Clint Eastwood.
Whoa, a damning Patrick McGilligan bio. That's a first.
Yeah, that's right. A relentlessly negative biography of Clint Eastwood. Yeah, I learned from that book that James Fargo found himself cast outside the Garden of Eden that was Malpaso after, the movie made $100 million or something back when that really meant something. And, he didn't get any royalties from it. Not that he was promised any royalties, but he said something like, sir, Mr. Eastwood, could I possibly, I had a few royalties from this? And they're like, get the fuck out, kid.
How dare you? I'm going to sleep with your wife. That's a classic Clint Eastwood move. Just completely destroy anyone that gets in his way. The town doesn't let him eat ice cream on the sidewalk. Well, he's gonna fucking become the mayor of that town.
First of all, I love Clyde the orangutan. I'm very moved by the relationship between him and Clint. I love how matter of fact it's presented. It's not even particularly sentimental. It's just a fact of life, these two best buddies together, and I love that. I also think, for the most part, Clint Eastwood, he lightens his persona a little bit by smiling sometimes.
He's never the source of humor in this movie. It's always the people that are surrounding him.
That's right. The movie is not at all self-deprecating, not even remotely.
He's never like, I want to fuck a horse, like Robert De Niro does in the classic Dirty Grandpa.
And in fact, this movie, Every Which Way But Loose, is scene after scene of Clint taking off his shirt and revealing his 48-year-old man body. A perfectly decent 48-year-old man's body, but like nothing particularly special, and just having fist fights and winning every single one of them. There's one scene towards the end when, he's beating up the sheriff where he hides in a tree and he jumps off the tree and then he stands up and he does a big muscular pose, and then he does a Tarzan yell, like literally a yell from the old Tarzan movies. And that reminded me of Rainier Wolfcastle on The Simpsons saying my next movie is called McBain. Let's get silly.
So, Every Which Way But Loose, the best way to describe it is Clint Eastwood's vanity project. He's a cool guy who sleeps with a lot of women, who has a pet orangutan, and is undefeatable as a fighter. That's it.
But what complicates it as a vanity project, or as a pure vanity project, is America said yes. America said, we agree.
You can make a vanity project and it be successful. Vanity project does not necessarily indicate that the movie in of itself is bad or is not liked by other people.
Yeah.
This is just the Clint persona, right? That I don't think he's acting very hard in Every Which Way But Loose. Do you think he's acting very hard?
No. No, I truly do not. And I think he probably gave James Fargo the job. There are car chases, there are stunts, and he probably said, I'd rather not have to think about that stuff. But for the most part, this is Clint's handpicked crew. This is all of Clint's actors are here. It's a Malpaso production. It's he's calling the shots without having to do, certain jobs that are tiresome to do.
It sounds like we're, pigeonholing Clint Eastwood as one thing, but then he can be challenged as an actor, or his persona tweaked in stuff like Play Misty for Me, The Beguiled, where the idea of Clint Eastwood is important to the text of the film itself and the way that it plays with his surroundings.
Well, yes, and in fact, he seems to have enforced this rigid dichotomy in his head of the one for them and the one for me. There are ones like this, which doesn't mean that he didn't work hard on some of the ones for them. But yeah, there are ones where he's willing to challenge himself more than others.
You mean something like Firefox, the one where He's, I believe, a pilot in that one, and he looks pissed off to be on the poster of that picture, even though that he stars and directs.
By the way,
it.
I've seen Pink Cadillac, and there's a whole midsection of that movie where he like disguises himself.
Yeah, he's a Gene Parmesan, right?
Yeah, that's right. Or he's like, does he have a Louisiana accent, or what is it that he's doing in that? He's got a little Richard John Waters mustache, and that's pretty cool. I like that. I also sort of love his performance in White Hunter Black Heart.
Oh, where his John Huston impersonation.
Right, which I think I underrated that movie a bit when we talked about it last time. I think it's an interesting movie, but his performance, if I had to give it any notes, I would say just do less.
I mean, he's not a guy that, other than those two things that we mentioned, that like challenges himself very much to step out of his comfort zone. He's a guy that realized very early on, this is what I'm good at, this is what people expect of me, so I can put myself in different situations, but myself cannot change or escape.
But you know what's interesting? He did do The Bridges of Madison County, which, like, his performance in that movie is very much like other performances he's given. But it's like, it's fascinating that he trusted that persona with an actor of Meryl Streep's caliber. And he, in fact, he's acted, not just her, he's acted alongside, you know, many other great actors, you know, who take the craft probably seriously in a different way than him, and he's trusted himself in that company.
Well, this is a great time to bring up the third movie that we watch, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, because Jeff Bridges is probably like the antithesis of Clint Eastwood's acting style. As far as Jeff Bridges is coming in just like a rocket, a dynamo, supposedly according to director Michael Cimino, would have tons of ideas of what he wanted to do, and Clint was like, you get 3 takes. We got it. We're moving on.
Right. And Michael Cimino, what can you say? Probably the most celebrated director to ever direct a Malpaso production who wasn't Clint Eastwood. This was his first feature directing credit, although he is one of the credited writers on The Enforcer, the second Dirty Harry film.
Did you know that Michael Cimino was a super heralded commercial director? Like, that's where he made his bones, was like these lavish, expensive kind of, you know, marketing push commercials. And then when he moved to films, that kind of perfection and obsession continued, but you wouldn't particularly know it watching this film.
By the way, I just want to note, because we may get asked, I am aware of the rumors that Michael Cimino may have identified in private as a trans woman towards the end of their life. I'm going with he, him pronouns just for this discussion, only because Cimino was not out, and I think it would be presumptuous to apply other pronouns. So with reluctance, I'm going to call Cimino he, him. But please know that I understand what's at stake here.
We could also just try they when we talk about Michael Cimino.
I'm up for that. Yeah, let's do that to be safe.
So Michael Cimino, as a director, are they one of your favorites? Like, do you think of Michael Cimino? I don't want to make this a whole Michael Cimino episode, but I think the kind of myth around them as a director is, to me, more interesting than the films themselves.
Well, yeah, it's a plainly compromised and imperfect career. You know, obviously there's The Deer Hunter, which I like. It has some problems, but I like it. And I really do like Heaven's Gate quite a bit. But I don't know if I can really call myself a fan based on that. I mean, Year of the Dragon is a lot of fun.
A lot of sleazy fun.
Actually, Year of the Dragon may be my favorite one now that I think of it.
Well, that's the only one that you saw with me, blown up in 70 millimeter at a once-in-a-lifetime screening.
What an incredible screening that was. And yeah, I would just say Desperate Hours is terrible, and I haven't seen the other two.
And so Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, as far as Cimino's signature, is interesting because it feels like they're playing almost like a game with Clint Eastwood. How much can Cimino get away with within the context of a Malpaso production?
Yeah, I was interested to read about this film in the recent biography of Cimino by Charles Elton. Very much describes this movie as, you know, almost the black sheep of the Cimino filmography. Obviously the one, despite everything that happened after, the one on which Cimino had the least creative control and was very much beholden to Clint. Even though Clint liked Cimino and gave and respected Cimino as the director, it's still Clint's crew, and Cimino was also playing by Clint's rules. Like, Cimino wanted to do a lot of takes, Clint Eastwood would only let them do so many takes.
And this is a project that was initiated on spec by Cimino that was brought to Clint Eastwood, expecting Clint Eastwood to direct the film, But after meeting Cimino, Clint Eastwood went, let Cimino direct, and I'll just co-star in it. And I wonder, like, would someone like Clint, where is Jeff Bridges' participation? Because this does not feel like an actor that Clint oftentimes would set himself up against, only because Bridges is such a dynamo that, like, it works in relation to Clint, but also your eye goes more to the young, useful vigor of some of Bridges.
Well, it's been rumored that Eastwood was a little bit unsatisfied with this movie, unsatisfied with the fact that it didn't make quite as much money at the box office as they were hoping, although it did well. But I think also probably because he was overshadowed so much by Jeff Bridges, who has much the showier part. And at this point, you know, he'd done The Last Picture Show, but he was a fresher face. So of course, like, he's the new thing on screen. He's what people are going to pay attention to in the context of 1974. But, you know, I like this movie, and I think Cimino's importance, you know, the proof is in the pudding when you compare this movie to the other movies that most of the other, like, friends of Clint directed. It's the non-Eastwood directed Malpaso production, maybe aside from Tightrope, that feels most like, you know, a real movie, that has, like, the strongest artistic decisions. You know, it feels like a Malpaso movie in the sorts of actors who are in it and the sorts of backdrops they're against. You know, these Midwestern landscape that you don't often see in movies that feel very much like, you know, Malpaso terrain.
And it's also a pretty film, but it's also not like Heaven's Gate, an unreal film at the prettiness is kind of like smacking you in the face every time there's a cut.
Yeah, I mean, when you compare it to Every Which Way But Loose, which looks, I mean, Every Which Way But Loose looks good, but it has that Malpaso house style where it's like very bright, you know, just artful clouds and a blue sky, very easy to look at. Whereas this has a kind of like hazy, misty, overcast sheen to much of it that gives it an atmosphere that has telltale signs of Cimino in addition to Malpaso.
And it's also about tone and control, where, like, you watch a Clint Eastwood film, it's very efficient and direct, and you can almost feel the, like, cut, we got it. Well, Cimino, you feel, even though that they were working under the constraints of Clint, that there were ideas that they were trying to imbue with the film. Just the structure of the film being like, the first half is Jeff Bridges and Clint Eastwood doing their most easy writer pastiche that they can do. Like, they even talked about it, like, well, what are the kids doing? Like, let's just do a road movie or something like that. And then the second half is more Don Siegel-esque, as it's just like, all right, we're doing a heist, and here is the construction, the pieces of the heist, and the execution of that heist.
Yeah, and it's very beautifully managed, I think.
Absolutely. But seeing how we're talking about Clint Eastwood, the actor, not much is demanded of him in this film. That he is, again, basically Clint Eastwood.
Yes, and I think to the extent that the movie plays with his persona in any way, it's simply putting him on the screen with an actor like Jeff Bridges, who the two of them, I think the closest comparison I could make elsewhere in Clint's filmography is like him and Eli Wallach in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But frankly, Jeff Bridges pops much more in relation to Clint Eastwood, I think because Eastwood doesn't really have novelty on his side at this point. I think you kind of take Eastwood for granted at this point. One spends so much time, at least I find, looking at Jeff Bridges in this movie much more than Clint Eastwood.
Well, yeah, because you're like, I know what I'll get out of Clint Eastwood.
And I would also just say, like, in the years since seeing this movie for the first time, whenever I've thought about it, which has not been that often, I've only thought about Jeff Bridges.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which doesn't mean that Eastwood's bad in the movie. It just means that, like, Jeff Bridges is the novelty here.
I love the poster is like, wait, is Clint Eastwood Thunderbolt and Lightfoot? Is Lightfoot the gun? Because Jeff Bridges is nowhere to be seen on the theatrical poster.
Yeah.
So Clint, as an actor, I think that what we've drilled down to here is he does one thing well, and he took control of his career, and he kept doing that one thing. Even though that, like, we say that, and as a director, he's been so experimental and willing to challenge himself, but as an actor, he is just that one thing that he does very well.
I mean, I think it's, I hate to keep bringing up Woody Allen.
Yeah, you really hate bringing him up.
Yeah. I just think the two of them have a similarity where it's like they're two guys who can act a certain way, and, like, you can't imagine either of them doing a crying scene. But, like, they've put this persona in many different kinds of movies, many different kinds of tones, and, like, the way that those movies refract off of them shows how like rich the thing they're doing can be.
But then Clint Eastwood did cry in Bridges of Madison County, and you buy it in that film when it happens.
Oh man,
I don't think Woody Allen has ever shed a tear in his life.
My God, I'm just thinking of that scene in the Bridges of Madison County where he's standing in the rain. Oh my God, there are days when I think that's his best movie.
You know what? Yeah, when you think of Bridges of Madison County, it's not one that you feel the weight of, it's an awards contender, or Clint just wanted to do the big dramatic thing. You're like, no, it's a movie that completely works in exactly what it's trying to do, and it's so simple in its execution that it just stays with you in a way that goes even beyond the kind of joke baggage that it has. As we all remember, the classic episode of Family Matters where Carl rents Bridges of Madison County and is disgusted that Clint Eastwood doesn't blow up any bridges in the movie.
One more thing. You were right to mention that, like, Clint Eastwood has never really had a dirty grandpa phase. He's never like deconstructed his persona, quote unquote, in quite that way. I think it's interesting that he's never been like Burt Reynolds either. Like he's never, well, obviously he's been like Burt Reynolds, but he hasn't been like Burt Reynolds, you know, in Boogie Nights or Burt Reynolds when he made that Adam Rifkin movie, The Last Movie Star. There's never been a period where like we have to recover Clint.
Yeah, Clint has never like kind of let himself go. And he's never, which is kind of shocking, fallen in the eyes of his viewing public. Now, there has been kind of, you know, fallow periods, like when he's doing, what is that detective blood movie that he directed? It's like
Blood Work, yeah.
But like, while that's a bad Clint Eastwood film to some people, no one just dismissed Clint Eastwood as being lost from that point on. Clint has always been in high esteem, even when he's making The Mule, where people are like, you look like Jimmy Stewart. And it's like, what are you talking about? This 110-year-old mummy who still fucks, as we see in that movie, still a cool guy, has not fallen out of favor with anyone in the world, pretty much.
I mean, it really says something where a movie like Cry Macho, which obviously was not like a box office success, but I think you watch Cry Macho and you say, like, obviously it's a little ridiculous, the scene in that movie where he throws a punch, but just the fact that he's lived long enough and maintained enough power in the industry that he can do that at 91, it's like he won. You can make fun of him, but he won.
Well, you know, actually, there is a slightly fallow period of Clint Eastwood. How could we forget The Empty Chair?
Oh.
Isn't that something that was defining him at that point?
And then he made
American Sniper.
Then he made American Sniper. And also that speech was the same year as his Super Bowl halftime show ad. You know, it's halftime in America. So yeah, there was that. But I guess at the end of the day, all that matters is that he kept making people money.
Yep, that's right. I mean, American Sniper comes out and we all remember making fun of the baby in that movie. And his legacy is so kind of massive that that's already fallen away. That like people don't think of The Changeling or Space Cowboys that much. They're like, oh, I think of the classics like Casper when Clint Eastwood shows up in the mirror for some reason.
God, it's a vast filmography, and what can you say? He's a god.
Yeah, we'll return to the subject. I feel we have to do like sentimental. Oh no, I got it. The bad Clint Eastwood.
I would love to do the bad Clint Eastwood. We'll talk about Firefox. We'll talk about the Rookie, is it, with Charlie Sheen?
Oh man, written by Scott Spiegel, Sam Raimi's pal. He's one of the co-writers on that film, and Boaz Yakin, I think, the director of Remember the Titans.
And yeah, we'll watch Blood Work at some point because I haven't seen it. I like true crime. I think true crime is fun. So if it's half as good as true crime, I'm going to be having a good time.
So as per usual, you can send us letters at importantcinemaclubpodcast@gmail.com. And our first letter is from Nick, and he goes, The Opinion of Theseus. Hey, Justin and Will. I'm a longtime listener and Patreon subscriber, and the recent Cronenberg Revisited episode sparked a question. Will mentioned in the episode that he used to be harder on Cronenberg's work, using Robin Wood's writing as his basis. After watching or reading some form of media, sometimes I too will see someone else's review, and that will help form the basis of my thoughts and opinion. I usually try to avoid this, as it almost feels like cheating in a sense. I like to form my own thoughts and feelings as much as possible. Parts of me debate on whether it is a process to help articulate ideas, or if it's just a shortcut to understanding a work without engaging too much with it. I'm in no ways against discussion and helping to understand or appreciate art, but as two identifiable voices in the online forum, how do you two balance other people's opinions with your own? Thanks, Nick.
Good question. I was going to ask you to go first.
I could talk about it. I think this is something that I felt more affected by when I was a teenager that had access to criticism, but not the media. I've talked about it a lot, like reading stuff like Cult Flicks and Trash Picks or Asian Cult Cinema, and that like an idea of what a film is baked into me because I don't have access to these things. So without being able to watch them myself and form an opinion, some movies I'd probably be like, it's not really good, only because I remember what some guy in a book said a long time ago. But now that doesn't really affect. I like reading other people's criticism about stuff only because it allows me to view things from different perspectives. I don't feel like I am influenced that much of a groupthink or even just like an individual that's very clear in the way that they're talking, because I feel pretty comfortable in what I like and I don't like at this point.
I definitely think that, yeah, like Justin, there were certain books that when I was really young, I would use as sort of guides for like, what are the correct opinions? I probably wouldn't have thought this way at the time, but like, you're just trying to figure out like what the canon is, you know, what's considered good and bad, just because you haven't seen these things and you need a roadmap.
And Robin Wood, I feel, is such a kind of well-written voice who is so authoritative about a lot of stuff that he's talking about that when you're coming to his work, you assume, oh, I see his perspective. This seems like one that makes sense based on the work itself.
I would say that like I'm always influenced by lots of people. I think more perspectives are better just because knowing more is better. And more perspectives, I think, can only make you appreciate art more. And I would say that like I would truly rather like things than not like them. And, you know, even the things I don't like, I'm sometimes very interested by interesting perspectives on what they mean to other people. You know, I think one of the pleasures of getting older is that certain things that maybe you didn't understand or that just weren't for you can start to open up. It's happened to me a lot over the years, and I hope it continues to happen. So I don't think being influenced is a bad thing.
I don't think so either. It's just like you said, being open to things. Like when we say being open, as Will just kind of pointed out, it's not about like learning to dislike something. If anything, it's opening up and liking something more. And I too will find that when I go to things that I dismiss out of hand, maybe because I saw it 10 years ago, I will find something else to like, maybe a performance, or I will realize, no, I really don't like this. And something in my old age that I have to do is go like, all right, I'm not going to watch this again. Like, this is enough. I've watched this enough. I do not need to wait 10 years and to go back and be like, oh yeah, my opinion is still on solid ground.
Yeah, actually, that is true. As I get older, there are certain things, much as I think I do like more things than I ever have before, and I'm more open to more things, there are certain things that I think I can trust myself to just skip. Like there are certain Best Picture nominees this year that I think I'm probably not going to like that. And there are only so many hours in a day and only so many days in your life. So it's okay to have taste and have opinions. But just one more thing. I've always liked David Cronenberg, and Robin Wood's perspective on David Cronenberg, which, as I said in that episode, maybe heavily colored my understanding of Cronenberg for a while. It's never made me dislike Cronenberg. I think sometimes dissenting takes can, in fact, open up the work in interesting new ways, and you can incorporate those into how you understand the work.
One of the things now is the reality that there aren't that many critical figures that I look up to and that I'm like, how can they not like this thing that I like? Like, everyone that I follow on Letterboxd, you know, there's certain people that I'm always like, if they love a movie, I'm like, oh man, I got to check this movie out. And if they don't like a movie that I like, I go, yeah, that's fine. They didn't like something that I like. I'm always shocked when people disagree with my own opinions, because I feel like I have very down the line, everybody agrees with me kind of opinions. But other than that, you know, I don't expect people to like the stuff that I like. And I've said this before, that one of the best things you can do as a movie fan is coming to the realization that people close to you, your friends, may not particularly have the same reaction to the movies that you enjoy. And once you realize that, and you can more tailor their experiences, maybe challenging them a little bit, but not too much. There's much more joy there, and you're not setting yourself up for being disappointed in some way, because that's just the reality of the world. So thank you very much for that letter. And our next letter is from Patrick. And he goes, "Hey guys, long time, first time. I just heard your discussion around your Ron Oliver curiosity in the most recent episode, and I felt compelled to share my own Ron Oliver experience. Check out last week's episode, or I believe that's the one where, or maybe even the week before that, where we talked at length about director Ron Oliver of Prom Night 3 fame and every film that ever played on the Hallmark Channel, basically."
That's right.
The letter continues. "Last year at the Music Box Theater in Chicago's annual 24-hour horror movie marathon, Prom Night 3 was screened for a packed house with Ron Oliver in attendance for a Q&A. I'm delighted to report he is an absolute blast and seems so genuinely pleased that some horror movie he made decades prior was screening for hundreds of people. Realizing that he is a gay filmmaker was an immediately interesting lens with which to look at Prom Night 3, and I'm assuming the rest of his movies. And during his Q&A, he also revealed 2 fantastic tidbits, in particular about Prom Night 3. The first being that he shot it with the intention of it being a live-action Looney Tunes short, and secondly, the story of his dinner with the film financiers who happened to bring along whom he described as their cute adult son. Oliver then revealed to a shocked crowd that this family was the Menendez family, and the murders happened only weeks after their dinner and subsequently delayed the start of filming."
Holy shit. What a story.
Yeah, people don't know, the Menendez family funded a lot of films back in the day. All that to say, he seemed like an incredible nice guy with a great sense of humor about himself and his work. I think he may be onto something digging deeper into his filmography. I certainly had the same thought after seeing the man and his work in person last year. Best, Patrick.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that. Ron Oliver sounds like a great guy. I mean, Prom Night 3 obviously speaks for itself, and I would just underline a few of the other movies that he's directed. And I say this, again, with admiration. I think this is a really cool filmography. I respect anybody who works this hard and has made this much and has survived this long in the industry. He's directed Bigger, Fatter, Liar. He's directed A Dennis the Menace Christmas, featuring Robert Wagner as Mr. Wilson.
What are the Ron Oliver passion project? That's what I want to know. What are the ones that he's like, this is one of the winners, the one that I put myself completely into?
I would like to know that too. And if anybody knows Ron Oliver, please ask him, because David Dakota has Leather Jacket Love Story. Roger Corman had The Intruder. What is that film for Ron Oliver? Maybe there is one.
Fred Olen Ray has Bikini Drive-In, all the ones that really meant something to them. So thank you very much for that letter, and we hope our Ron Oliver quest continues. This week on our Patreon, we continue our journey through Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Yes, we do.
Long delayed. Will had to savor it a little bit longer, right, Will?
I mean, we're just gonna try to do this. I like Neon Genesis Evangelion, and we're just gonna see if I have anything to say about it. We're gonna record it right after this, and you two can find out.
Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen. I wrote a lot of notes and a lot of very general questions that I can ask Will through this. A little teaser of what we're going to talk about. We are currently in the action arc of the show before it gets weird and gets to the stuff that really make people fall in love with the show. So let's just get over this hump this episode, and we're getting to the good meaty stuff right after this. Next week, Swip Swip. Oh my God. Do you hear that sound? It's everyone's favorite wall crawler, Spider-Man. Spider-Man. I'm trying to do it like Stan Lee.
That's right. We've been talking for a while about, sometimes we like to do some popular episodes.
How do we sell out? How do we sell out?
And it's funny because I feel like whenever anybody's actually discovered this podcast, it's because they Googled Ray Dennis Steckler, and we were the only people who did a podcast on him. But nevertheless, I think there are some casual listeners who would prefer to hear things that they've heard of.
I would be curious. Are there listeners out there who only listen when they recognize the filmmaker that we're talking about? There has to be, right?
Write in, tell us. I'd love to know.
Yeah, join us on the Discord if you're a Patreon subscriber. Just let us know. I mean, the numbers. I know what the answer is.
So we've been thinking about what's a superhero topic we can do? Because, superheroes, ka-ching, money in the bank, am I right? And we were thinking it would be fun to revisit the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, because I haven't seen any of those movies in forever. And not only would it be interesting to sort of reacquaint ourselves with what Sam Raimi brought to those films, but also those were the movies that, probably even more than like Richard Donner's Superman or Tim Burton's Batman, set the template for the superhero movie that we are currently living with.
And the arc of those movies is kind of fascinating because there is one authorial voice behind them, but it started with him going, I want to play it safe, Sam Raimi, and I just want to deliver something that will not be that wacky Sam Raimi thing that people expect. And then in the second one, he's like, all right, this one needs to be perfect. I need to get this 100% correct, and I can be wacky. And then in the third one, even though he had delivered them two massive successes, the producers are like, we think we know what needs to happen. And then you get what you get with Spider-Man 3. And people will not be shocked to learn that I probably watched most of these like 2 years ago. So we'll be watching Spider-Man 1, 2. Did you know, Will, that there is an alternate cut by Bob Murawski called the editor's cut of Spider-Man 3.
Can we watch it?
Yes, I have it on Blu-ray. It was included on the box set. I'll send it to you. So that's what we're doing next week. It is Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, the birth of the modern superhero film. Until then, my name's Justin Klugh.
I'm Will Sloan.
Thanks for listening. As per usual, I would like to thank some of our new patrons who include Jack Charles, Mike Malloy, Andrew68, Dana Woolery, Luke Cross, Moritz Anton, Michelle, Yasmina, Maximilian Strand, Matthew McGraw, Alex Cunningham, John Jaraki, Jake the Cat, Noah Height, and Alex Boone. Thank you very much for becoming patrons. We would not keep doing this without you.
Last weekend, I dropped by the University of Toronto at Innis College to see Stephen Broomer's Ad Hoc series. Stephen Broomer, as well as others, Bart Testa is on the board as well. It's an experimental film society where they show, classic and contemporary experimental film for free. So if you're in Toronto or you're visiting Toronto, just look up Ad Hoc Film Toronto, because, every couple of weeks they'll show, well, in a few weeks they're going to show Stan Brakhage movies on 16 millimeter. That should be pretty interesting. But just this last week, they showed Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising and Jean Genet's Enchant d'Amour, two of the classics, two of the oft-censored classics of early underground film, both on 16 millimeter prints. I was about to say beautiful 16 millimeter prints, and they are.
No, those prints aren't beautiful.
They're beautiful in their way,
Yes. They've been lived in, if you will.
The Jean Genet film definitely looked like looking through a slightly smudgy peephole, which is how it should look. You're spying on gay people in prison jerking off. And that should look like you're seeing it from a distance a little bit. But the print of Scorpio Rising that was on 16 millimeter actually was quite good. The color was quite strong. And as I was watching Scorpio Rising, I thought to myself, fuck, how have I seen this movie so many times? I don't feel like I've sought it out that many times. It's just like, because it's one of those canonical experimental films, it's just like every 3 or 4 years I find myself in a context where I'm seeing Scorpio Rising.
Wait, so we did a Kenneth Anger episode. You probably watch it out of your own curiosity when you're getting into movies and you hear that it was a big inspiration on Martin Scorsese. You probably watch it in film school as well.
Probably saw it at the Anthology Film Archives.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I bought the Kenneth Anger Blu-ray set, so I probably saw it then. I could have seen it at some other screening like this somewhere. If you're interested in film and you're interested in really interesting, and experimental films, you're probably just going to accidentally see Scorpio Rising at least 10 or 15 times in your life. At least that's my experience.
Now, when you see that Scorpio Rising is playing, are you like, gotta see it? It's my duty. Got to go to a 60 millimeter print screening of it.
I don't think of it in terms of duty.
No, but you want to see it.
I want to see it. It's like, I see it and I think, Scorpio Rising on 16 millimeter. How often am I going to get a chance to see that? Probably not very often.
And then you think back and you're like, wait, have I seen it half a dozen times on 16 millimeter already?
Yeah. Although I'm actually not sure that I've ever seen the Jean Genet film, Enchant d'Amour. I think it may have been my first time seeing it, which is insane because it's another one of the classics. It's wild I never got to it.
I love those Stephen Broomer screenings. You've probably heard, if you're a regular to this podcast, I interviewed Stephen Broomer about his Black Zero label, where he releases Canadian experimental films on beautifully context-filled Blu-ray releases. Pick them all up. How difficult it is for him to do screenings because he's mentioned that like they don't even have a 60 millimeter projector anymore, that like you had to hunt one down to rent to play at the university. You would expect the universities to have 60 millimeter projectors on site to be able to play, but nope, they do not at the University of Toronto.
Tragic. My God.
I mean, I just think of that amazing University of Toronto archive. And like back in the day, me and Peter could rent movies from there until they made it so complicated that like we couldn't anymore. And we're like, but why do you have these movies? Like, why if we can't play them, why do you have them?
If I got the story accurate, that you and Peter wanted to play one of David Tui's movies.
Yes, we wanted to play his first film. There is a 35 millimeter print of it in the university archive, Timescape. I was thinking of the other title, Grand Tour Disaster in Time. And the University of Toronto was like, sorry, if you don't find the person who owns the film, we can't give it to you. To the point that we got the producer of the film and David Tui to like write notes being like, we don't know who owns it. They can have it. University of Toronto was still like, nope, sorry, you can't have it. So at that point, it's just going to collect dust forever, right?
I mean, that bothers me because like Colin Geddes gave, I don't know, 235 millimeter prints of Kung Fu movies, 70s Kung Fu movies to that library. And it's like so many of those movies were owned by companies that just went out of business. They've got a 35 millimeter print of The Chinese Stuntman with Bruce Lee. And like, who's ever going to find who owns that movie?
You know, it makes me wonder, like, what is... Maybe people that work at an archive could speak more to this, because I've worked with archives of stuff I put out through Gold Ninja Video who were very accommodating. They, like, worked with me very well. But, like, I wonder if University of Toronto, it's like they lent out a rare print to someone, they just, like, beat it up to crap, or maybe even didn't return it, and then they had to lock it down and be like, we cannot do this anymore.
I think what probably happened was they gave a print, and then some copyright owner, some disgruntled copyright owner, yeah, they probably got in touch with the university and said, cease and desist, we will sue you for this. And then they probably said, okay, new policy, we're never risking this again.
And then you have movies like, well, I don't think I got it from them. I think I got it from the E1 archives. Star Kid, which we played on 35 millimeter, a film that like barely played theatrically.
Star Kid. I mean, God, just a shimmering, beautiful film. I mean, University of Toronto has a lot of stuff because like whenever a company goes out of business in Toronto, they're just like, where do we put this warehouse full of reels? And the University of Toronto is like one of the two places they can maybe deposit it.
I would be curious. Yeah, again, let me reiterate the question of like, if anybody who works at archive, what is your policy of renting out prints? Are there any martial arts prints perhaps in your collection? Give me a ring, because I would definitely be willing to rent them and perhaps scan them. The archive I did work with, I did tell them like what I was doing with them. And they're like, yeah, okay, yeah, no problem. These prints that I asked for were literally collecting dust, and no one had ever rented them, to the point that they're like, we have to check if this is actually playable, because no one has ever asked for Revengeful Swordswoman before. So yeah, anyone archive, I would love to know what the story, how do you work? Like some archives, they just scan prints because they have nothing else to do, and they put them in their archive and they just sit on them because they have nothing else to do with them, but they're just like archiving them for that reason. But it needs to get out in the world. University of Toronto, we would love to play your films. And some of them, like when they did Emmanuel and the Cannibals, they could only play it if they got like 3 academics from out of town to do a talk afterwards. It's the only way that they could justify it. Oh, the University of Archive of Toronto has a print of Albert Pune's Nemesis, because we played it once, I believe, at the Royal.
That's right, you did.
They also have a print of No Retreat, No Surrender 3 Blood Brothers, an amazing movie that we also did at the Royal, back when they used to be able to give us the prints and let them play them.